It works, Lynn. It's now on YouTube, I see.
Yeah, I've just started the sharing live to YouTube.
Okay. Okay.
And that's been tweeted out to, so we might get an audience.
Julie is saying that her link is not working. I don't know what happens.
I send the link again. I think that's one.
Yes, we can send it again, but I can also send it.
Or I can invite her, I think, manually through her email address.
I see that Dan is also in, the second speaker. Good.
I think Julie was having trouble, but I discovered that the link in the PDF worked.
Okay.
She should be in there. There we go.
And Julie is also joining us.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. What time is it your place, Julie?
Bright and early, 8 a.m.
8 a.m. Oh, it's not
It's
bad.
not
that
Request for Alex.
Alex,
In the middle of the night, more or less.
Yeah, I'm approaching midnight now, 11:30. But
okay.
yeah, it's always the issue in Australia, I guess.
And then you are from?
The East Coast, Rhode Island. So it's 9 a.m. Not too bad.
Oh,
Yep.
so not bad. Not bad.
Yep.
I'm admitting everybody else.
Oh, but now people are coming in. That's good.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening. Good afternoon. Good evening, Shackelton. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you all.
Yeah. Oh, Anupama is joining. Very good. Okay, it's 5 minutes past 3 o'clock, at least in the Netherlands. I know it's different time all over the world, but according to our schedule, I think we should start having this presentations this afternoon. I'm very happy that we are here and can hear also the nominees for the Shackelton Award medal this afternoon. Shackleton is, as you all know, is a very important and a distinguished scientist who was active some time ago. And apart from the fact that he was also awarded for his really great scientific work, he was also president of INQUA from the period of 1999 to 2003. And in that period, he did a lot to support especially young scientists. He was very keen on having things in INQUA installed that could promote the careers of young scientists. And to honor him, INQUA decided to launch the Sir Nicholas Shackelton Medal, and that medal was especially for outstanding young quaternary scientists. The community has been asked to nominate young scientists, and we received nominations for 4 scientists, and these nominations look really very impressive, and we thought it would be very nice to hear also from themselves what actually the type of research they are doing and what the achievement they have so far. And I'm really looking forward to hear their presentations this afternoon. Chair of the award committee in the board of INQUA is Professor Laura Sadori from Rome, and I would like to give the floor to Laura. She's chairing this afternoon session and will shortly introduce also the speakers, and will guide you through this afternoon. So I give the floor to Laura.
Good morning to everybody. Welcome to this nice meeting, because we are really happy to welcome such promising, but I would say more than promising, young scientists. They are young, but they already demonstrated wonderful CVs. I want to start, you already know the program. We are starting with Eleonora Regattieri, then we will have the introduction of Daniel Ibarra, then of Alexander Franke, and the last one will be Julie Loisel. We are very happy to have them, and it is so important for us have such interest in quaternary sciences. I have to make a premise. I am chairing the committee, but I want to take part in the evaluation, since I was co-author of 2 of the nominees, and so I will make a step back, and the evaluators will be the other members of the committee. If it is okay for all of you, I would start with Eleonora Regattieri. She's from Italy. She's a natural and environmental scientist. She was graduated in Pisa, in Italy, and her PhD was in geochemistry, and it was on interglacial hydrological diversity inferred from continental carbonates. She was a junior researcher for 2 years at the Department of Geology in Pisa since 2017, and she has also been teaching at since that time. And now she has a permanent position as a researcher in the Italian National Research Council at the Institute of Earth Sciences and Georesources. She is the author of 63 papers that are indexed in Scopus database. She was nominated by Giovanni Monegato, Antonello Provenzale, and Russell Drisdale. Eleonora, you have 20 minutes for your presentation, and then a short discussion will follow. Thank you. So I'm giving the floor to you, Eleonora. No, Eleonora, we can't hear you.
Can you see Marita? Me? Laura,
Yes?
can you see my screen? Can you hear me?
No. We cannot
Laura,
try to see your
Can you see
screen.
the screen also?
No, no.
Yes. Why?
Now we can see
stop
you. Just start
the
again sharing your screen.
division and try again. Okay. Now, is it working?
No. Lynn, has she been
We
authorized?
tested it worked earlier. I'm not sure.
Laura, can you hear me?
Why?
Does it my screen works?
No, it doesn't, Leonora.
I tried 5 minutes ago. Now?
Yeah.
So let me stop it. I don't know why we tried like 2 minutes ago. And let me try again.
Now it's starting. We cannot see it yet, but it's starting.
Is it working now? Can you see it?
Not completely.
Oh. I don't know why. Working like 5 minutes.
Now it's working. But I cannot hear your voice continuously. There are problems.
Wi-Fi is unstable.
Now,
Maybe we should move to the next speaker and give her some time.
I'm here, but I don't know what happened. Can you?
We saw it for a brief moment and then, there we go. Brilliant.
Now? Is it working?
Perfectly now.
I don't understand what happened. So, okay, sorry for this delay and thank you for this nomination. And thank you also for this chance to present my results. Please stop me if everything went wrong. So the general aims of my research is to reconstruct in detail the spatio-temporal variability of quaternary climates and environment in the Mediterranean region. The main purposes of my research are to reconstruct the processes that force, trigger, transmit, and amplify those variations, to understand the teleconnection that links the climatic variation on regional, hemispheric, and global scale, and also to reconstruct which was the impact of the past changes on environment, ecosystem, water, and soil resources. The underlying motivation of my research is that, as you know very well, only the study of the past climatic and environmental change can provide us with a deep understanding of the long-term functioning of the Earth system. It may also help us to define baselines and reference conditions, and can also help to provide data to develop reliable future scenarios. All those themes are, I would say, particularly urgent in the Mediterranean region. Indeed, it is already strongly impacted by the global change, with rates of change that already exceed global trends for most of the variables. And the Mediterranean is also a hotspot in future climate projection. It means that it's a region that is very sensitive to global warming. This sensitivity of the Mediterranean is related to the fact that it lies at the boundary between the high and the low latitudes. And so its hydrology is modulated both by the North Atlantic, oceanic and atmospheric condition that influenced mostly the rainfall amount and the internal cyclogenesis, especially during winter, but it is also under the influences of the low latitude circulation pattern. And particularly we have that the seasonality of the precipitation here is modulated by the tropical circulation. So variation in the extra-regional circulation patterns are most expressed in terms of hydrological variability in the Mediterranean. And so it means that if we are able to reconstruct the hydrological variability of the Mediterranean, we are in a key area to understand the functioning of the global climate system. I devoted a good part of my research to the study of past interglacial periods, as Laura said, and especially of those of the last 800 kilo years, because as summarized very well by this paper here from Tsatakis et al. 2009, they represent a basis of comparison with the present interglacial and its future evolution. If we look at the records from the last 800 kilo years, if we look at the interglacials, we can see that they are characterized by a great diversity, both in terms of a combination of forcing, but also in terms of internal characteristic. Indeed, the intensity, the duration, and the internal variability were different in each cases, and those differences do not appear to be linearly related to the boundary condition itself. So it means that by studying those periods, we can be able to understand the sensitivity of the Earth system to different forcing. We can also evaluate the background of natural variability in which the human-induced changes operate. And we can also clarify where we are in the natural progression of the events. But to do this properly, we need to produce the well-dated, detailed, and globally representative paleoclimatic records. And this is exactly what I've done, what I devoted my research to. So to the production and interpretation of high resolution and multi-proxy geochemical and geochronological records from speleothems and lake sequences in the central Mediterranean. Let me explain you why the Mediterranean continental carbonates met those requirements, so why they are so good as climatic archives. First of all, as for every carbonates, they form within the hydrological cycle, and they also receive input from the atmosphere, the biosphere, the soil. And so it means that they have multiple properties that are sensitive to climatic and environmental parameters that allow to use a multi-proxy approach that give us very detailed reconstruction. Among these properties, the oxygen isotopic composition of the carbonate, it's a very good proxy because it is a proxy for that of the meteoric water that from which those deposits form. And in the Mediterranean, the oxygen isotope are the best traces of the hydrological cycle. So it means that the delta 18 of the Mediterranean carbonates allow to reconstruct the hydroclimatic variability of the past. I also said that we need well-dated records. Well, in the Mediterranean, we have extensive cave system with abundant and high-quality speleothems that were deposited over very long intervals, at least back to 2 million of years ago. And so they are suitable for high-density radiometric dating by the uranium, thorium, and the uranium lead dating method. In the Mediterranean, we also have a very thick lacustrine sediment sequences that were deposited in intermontanic tectonic basins since the Pliocene. And thanks to the intense volcanic activity of the Mediterranean quaternary volcanoes, so we have a lot of volcanic ash layers interbedded within the sediment, the lacustrine sediment. And those layers provide very robust and widespread stratigraphic markers, and especially in central Italy, where we are close to the source, they are coarse enough to be dating with the independent method of the argon-argon dating. So it means that from the continental carbonates in the Mediterranean, there is the chance to obtain independent radiometric chronology to which anchor the multiproxy record that we have derived. So here are some of my results. They are Delta 18 records from caves and lakes in the central Mediterranean. Here you can see the site. They all have a multi-decadal to centennial temporal resolution, and they are all independently dated with radiometric methods. I cannot enter too much into details here, but for interglacial periods, you can take that the first order driver for the delta 18 is the amount of rainfall. And so we have lower isotopic values where when the climate is wetter, and we have higher delta 18 values when the climate is drier. So all those records represent well-dated records of Mediterranean hydrological variability, covering past interglacial periods and the Holocene. I will focus mostly on the MIS5, not because it is the more recent period that I studied, but because it well summarizes the approaches and also the implication of my research, at least in my opinion. So the last interglacial or Imean interglacial within the marino-isotopic stage 5 stands out as the warmest interglacial of the last 800 kiloyears. It was due to a different combination of orbital forcing and particularly to a higher northern hemisphere summer insolation in the first part of the interglacial. This different combination of forcing resulted in a global temperature anomalies of 1.5 degree warmer than the pre-industrial. And when I started to study the last interglacial for my master thesis in 2009, the paradigm was that the last interglacial was slightly warmer than the present. Well, the temperature anomalies of the last interglacial is already indistinguishable from the warming that we are facing in the last decade, especially in the Mediterranean. So, despite the forcing was different, the last interglacial is an excellent contest in which study processes and interactions that occur during the interval of excess warmth. And particularly interesting is its short scale, I would say suborbital variability. Indeed, if we look at the North Atlantic records for the MIS5, we have widespread evidences for centennial to millennial event of excess cooling and the position of isolated breeze. And we also have some records that tell us that there are changes in surface hydrography and also in deep water ventilation. If we look at the climatic framework from the Mediterranean, from the land, from the continental, in the Mediterranean and in Europe, we also have widespread evidences for dry and cold events within the Imean, but there were some ambiguities. So it is not clear how the cooling events in the North Atlantic relate to changes in water circulation, how they relate to cryosphere dynamics, and how they relate to the instability that we see on land. Indeed, also, okay, we know that there was some instability on land, but it was difficult to assess how those events related among sites or to place them in the broader context of oceanic changes. And those ambiguities arise mostly from the lower amplitude of the interglacial variability, but also from an uneven, scarce resolution, and also from a poor chronological control. And this is what we try to address by studying those three sites, the Sulmona Lake, Tanake Urla Cave, and Corchia Cave on the Apuan Alps. Here you can see their oxygen records, consider that they are all independently dated. And you can see that there is a very strong and current expression of hydrological variability among the records. For example, if we look at the glacial interglacial transition, or if we look at the glacial inception. particularly for the glacial inception, if we compare the hydrological records from the Mediterranean with the Greenland record or with the temperature record from the Alps, the North Atlantic, and the Mediterranean, we can see that when the bipolar thermal seesaw is active, there are strong teleconnection linking the temperature of the North Atlantic with the hydrology of the Mediterranean. Indeed, when the North Atlantic is warm, meaning that the IMOC is very active. We have higher SST temperature at the mid latitudes, and it means that we have evaporation and advection and a lot of precipitation within the Mediterranean. Instead, when we are within stadials and the AMOC is depressed, we have lower SST, and it means that we have lower evaporation and drier condition within the Mediterranean. Then, if we look directly and especially at the interglacial portion of the record, we can see that the three records currently expressed several events of reduced precipitation within the interglacial. And so the question was, what caused this intra-interglacial variability and how it relates with the extra-regional climate? So first we compared the Sulmona Cork and Tanake-Urla record with this SST record in the Western Mediterranean, and we found that there was a correlation between SST cooling in the Western Mediterranean and periods of reduced precipitation from our hydrological record of the Central Mediterranean. The event of SST cooling in the Western Mediterranean were correlated with the North Atlantic cold events from the subpolar records. And so the hypothesis that we made is that the variability that we observe in our record was related to AMOC slowdown and to associated changes in the atmospheric circulation. Then we have the chance to properly test these hypotheses thanks to collaboration with the Tsadakis group that works on the Iberian margin. Indeed, you know that the Iberian margin is an area which is sensitive to paleoclimatic changes, both in the oceanic and terrestrial realms, and especially the marine proxies can tell us which is the state of the North Atlantic circulation and which is also the state of the Atlantic in general. So we compare our record with the multi-proxy, our hydrological records with the multi-proxy record of the MD 2444, where they have studied the joined together the pollen content, so a proxy for the vegetation on the Iberian Peninsula, and they also studied the marine proxy that, as I said, tell us about the state of the North Atlantic. So here you can see the comparison between the forest composition in Iberia and the hydrological records from the Mediterranean, and you can see that there is a current expression of the multi-centennial scale hydrological variability. This means that both the forest composition in Iberia and the Italian oxygen records respond to variation in the amount of rainfall, and this formed the basis to transfer the independent chronology from Corkia to the MD 2444 record. So it allows to check if there is an expression of the drier events within the marine proxies, and the answer was yes, indeed there was a coeval change in the surface hydrography and also coeval changes in the water conditions, and those changes were significant. And then we can compare the record from the Iberian margin with the subpolar record. And the results was that the drier events were coherent with cold water mass expansion and changes in the deep water circulation in the North Atlantic. And this points to the fact that during the interglacial, we had significant reorganization of the AMOC circulation. So everything can be related to a variability of the AMOC, which is active during the interglacial. Then we try to address what causes these changes in the AMOC, and the results of the model was that the freshwater input from episodic melt of the Greenland ice sheets was able to increase the water stratification, leading to a weakening of the AMOC and the cooling of the North Atlantic, and that there is a relationship between those weakening of the AMOC and the drier events in the Mediterranean. So to sum up, come back to the beginning. The high summer insolation during the last interglacial caused episodic ice melting in Greenland. This melting caused the water stratification that causes weakening of the AMOC, and this influenced the westerly circulation. And the impact of that in the Mediterranean was that we have drier conditions. So the implication is that the short-term climatic instability within the interglacial can be linked to the high summer insolation, or simply to warming of the North Atlantic latitudes, warming like the one that we are facing today. So the warming of the high latitudes increased the possibility of abrupt climatic changes with chain effect that spread to the hemispheric level and can also affect the rainfall in the Mediterranean area. Well, just to finish, focus a bit more on the impacts. So we said the drier condition, but drier conditions is not enough to characterize the environments. So we also applied an integrated multi-proxy approach to reconstruct more in detail, the local environmental response. We did it for the Tanake-Urla by studying its trace element record, and we found that drier events were marked by reduction in the vegetation, and this caused an enhanced flux of mineral particles within the cave. Instead, during wetter conditions, there is stronger soil development that prevents the erosion of the catchment. We also investigated the mineralogical and elemental composition of the Sulmona sediment over the same period, and we found a similar pattern. So increased soil erosion and nutrient influx are apparent during drier periods, whereas during wetter period, the erosion is prevented by the development of the vegetation. So here we can be a little bit more detailed. So drier condition in the Mediterranean caused a decrease in the vegetation cover and an increase in the soil erosion. But this applied to the last interglacial, where everything was natural. It is always true. Well, then to conclude, show you something from the Holocene multiproxy record from Rio Martino Cave. You know that in the Holocene, the Mediterranean witnessed the transition from a natural dominated to a human dominated environments. And so the Holocene is the primary context to reconstruct the changes in the sensitivity of the Mediterranean environments under increasing anthropic pressure. So from Rio Martino, a cave here in the Southern Alps, we studied the oxygen isotopic composition, which is still a proxy for the precipitation amount. Then we study also the carbon isotopic composition, which is a proxy for the soil biological activity and evolution. And we also study the magnetic susceptibility, which is a proxy for the detrital input and the soil erosion. And what we found is that between 10 and 3 kiloyears intervals of drier condition correspond to decreased soil activity and to increased erosion, whereas after 3 kiloyears with the onset of the Iron Age, we have that soil degradation corresponds to wet periods. So there is a change in the way that the pedosphere responds to the climatic change. So the implication for that is that, okay, the impact, it's not the same as in the MIS5, but instead for the Holocene, the human modification modified the natural environmental functioning, causing heterogenesis in its response to the climate forcing. I've concluded. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eleonora. Are there questions for Eleonora, either in chat or?
I would like to ask one question to Eleonora. Some time ago, it was Maria Sansegoni who published data from an offshore core, offshore of Portugal, of the Iberian Peninsula. And then there was a problem between the offset of the dating of the MAS5 period in that core and the continental record. I'm sure you're aware of that, and I was wondering what do you find in this aspect? Do you see any difference in the timing of that the MIS5 on the continent, the impact, or is it all the same?
For what regard okay, we found a very good agreement between the terrestrial proxies, so our oxygen records and the forest records from Iberia for this period. And I think it is also, we also have a better match thanks to the very high resolution of both kind of records, because the work you mentioned, maybe the resolution was not so high. And the pattern that we saw between the pollen and the oxygen allow us to really straightforward correlate the two records. And yes, the changes that we saw in the marine proxies are smaller with respect to that we see, for example, during the transitional periods like the glacial inception and so on, but we tested and they are still significant. So I guess they are a true expression of smaller modification of the North Atlantic circulation. So we found a good correspondences between the terrestrial impact and the marine proxies. If I got the question, I guess that the previous differences were mostly due to the lower resolution of the pollen record. Indeed, we also worked with the MIS 19 pollen record, trying to do something similar from the Iberian margin, but also there the lower resolution hampered a bit the correlation. We saw some pattern which is similar, but it was more difficult to compare them properly because of the resolution mostly.
Yeah, I think also your results also show that that it is actually probably more a north-south gradient in the offset of the timing, and that is what what people already addressed this. But this is okay. I'm really happy with your results on this, because that makes life easier if there's not a big offset between the continental and marine. Thank you very much.
Depends on which moment. Maybe when the forcing are different, there can be delay or there can be a different expression. But at least for the last interglacial, when the forcing was so clear, because there was this very strong insolation, everything is, yes, in order, I would say.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions, please, for Eleonora?
If we have a minute,
Yes,
I would thank you for your talk. And there's a lot of information, and it was really nice to see it all come together. And one question I have, and I'm stepping outside of my knowledge here, so maybe it's an obvious answer, is what is the difference in the temperature or the climate seasonality between stage 5 and today? Because I'm wondering about the effect of winter versus summer warming and how that might impact the results that you see. And I don't even know if your record could say something about that, but it seems like it's...
So we can say something about seasonality for the MIS5 when maybe I can show you, because I had no time to explain, but the very first part of the email, I don't know if you see the screen again.
Yeah, we see it.
Okay, here, for example, I skipped this part about the seasonality, but here you can see that the very first part of the email is characterized by very negative isotopic values, and there is a seasonality effect. We thought that there was some seasonality effect here, meaning that we have an increase in the winter precipitation instead that a more humid general climate, and it was confirmed by the correlation that we found between those negative values with the higher percentages of Mediterranean essences in Tenaghi-Philippon. So yes, in the first part of the MIS5, the climate was more similar, seasonal, sorry, at least to respect to the second part. I think that it was also more seasonal than the Holocene, because okay, here you have this strong precession peak, this strong insolation, and so I guess yes, this particular combination of forcing during the MIS5 also caused an increase in the seasonality.
Cool. So it might look a little bit like the early Holocene in our case, not so much like.
It's not so negative from an isotopic point of view in the Mediterranean. This is why we think that it was that we have less concentrated winter precipitation, because usually winter precipitation are more and more negative.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Thank you to both. Other questions? Otherwise, we move to Dan. Okay.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Eleonora. And I'm going to introduce Danny Barra. He's a geologist and an environmental scientist. He graduated at Stanford University, and he got there a PhD on earth science, system science, on past regional changes in the water cycle. He was a research associate at Palo Alto, then he occupied different research positions, either at Stanford University and at University of California. And now, since this year, since 2021, he's assistant professor at the University of Brown in Providence. So he moved inside the same continent, but he moved eastward. He published 9 first author papers and gave important contribution to a total of 47 ones. Dan was nominated by John Williams, Frieden von Blankenburg, and Aradhana Tripathi. So, Daniel, please, you have, as the others, 20 minutes to introduce your research.
Okay. Well, thank you, Laura, for that nice introduction. And I also like to thank the ANQA folks that that nominated me for this medal in INQA. So before I start my talk today, I want to acknowledge that Brown University sits on ancestral and now occupied lands of the Wampanoag and Narragansett people. And I include this land acknowledgement to recognize the history of the land of Brown University, but also because the late Pleistocene lakes that I study in the Western United States are important geographic features relevant to the original peopling of North America during the last deglaciation, and is the traditional homelands of the Northern and Southern Paiute, the Washoe, and the Western Shoshone people. So today I'll tell you about my work on lakes in the Western United States over the Plio-Pleistocene. And I'll discuss how the landscape records dramatic changes in the water balance of the Western United States. So anywhere you go in the Western US, in the mountain ranges or in the valleys, you see evidence that the Pleistocene glacials were very different. Where I was standing here, this large U-shaped valley was once covered by over 1,000 feet of ice. Similarly, in many of the basins in the Great Basin, you see these shorelines that were first studied by G.K. Gilbert. And as you might have seen in science last year, the sort of study of the delta fans, the Gilbert type deposits, were of course recently found on Mars. And so these prominent shoreline features dot the landscape in the Western United States and have been a fascination of mine. And I think are an important record of past paleoclimate in the Quaternary. So here's a view of what the Western United States looked like during the last glacial maximum. This is Lake Bonneville from the last slide and Lake Lahontan. And you can see that they're relatively complex lake systems with multiple sub-basins that have to integrate at their high stands. And so a lot of the work that I focused on during my master's and PhD, and now as a faculty member at Brown, is looking at these smaller basins, starting first, as I'll show you today, in the Northwest Great Basin, expanding to this entire region. And then most recently, I'm now working in the sort of Death Valley, Mojave Desert region, and also applying these sorts of tools to places like Central Asia and in Tibet. And so what I'll demonstrate to you is that lake deposits from these terminal basins allow us to directly quantify past changes in the hydrologic cycle in a way that's potentially valuable for validating our models of future water cycle changes. So how did I get into this work? Well, one thing that I participated in during my early graduate school years was compiling proxies for the North American continent at the last glacial maximum. And this is work that I did with Jessica Oster that was published in 2015 and that we recently updated. And here I'm showing for the last glacial maximum, you can see the ice sheets shown here, proxies that are wetter, drier, or no change relative to today as interpreted by the authors for things like speleothems, soil carbonates and opals, lake records, pollen records, glaciers, etc. And one thing that we've done with this sort of proxy compilation is directly quantify how well the climate models are performing against for this given time slice. So here's an example from the previous PMIP3 ensemble, so the previous generation of climate models, just showing the agreement between the models and the proxies at the last glacial maximum, where you can see that the models generally do get right that the Southwest US was wetter. There's some disagreement about where this sort of transition zone between this dipole of wetter and drier conditions are, and generally agree with the proxies that it was drier as you approach the ice sheet moving northward. Okay, so this is interesting, but it's perhaps not as satisfying to all of us because it's not quantitative. And so one thing that I was challenged with during my PhD work was to develop more quantitative constraints on the hydrologic cycle. So today I'm basically going to jump in and start with a little bit of the field and measurement approach that I've used with just a few slides, and then I'll move into the modeling approach. So in terms of the measurements, the field observations and the measurements, we use what I like to call a shore-based approach. And here's an example from some of my work in Northeast California and Surprise Valley, California, that we originally published on in 2014 and have subsequently followed up on in several publications. You can see these beautiful shorelines similar to Lake Bonneville that record over 200 meters of lake level change. And here in the LiDAR imagery, I'm just showing you how that pops up and where we've collected, in this case, tufa samples on these wave cut shorelines. And so in my work, I use different geochronology constraints to date these carbonate samples, both radiocarbon and uranium thorium disequilibrium. So shown here is just a summary of what we found for Lake Surprise over the course of these 3 publications that are listed here in the bottom right, all of which I was involved in. What we found is that during the last glacial maximum, this lake was actually not very high. It only stood less than 100 meters deep, and it slowly grew as the deglaciation began. And partway through Heinrich Stadio 1, there was a large increase in precipitation. And in previous modeling, we suggested that you require something like 75% increase in precipitation to drive this high stand, assuming minimal changes in evaporation between the LGM and Heinrich Stadio 1. So what does this actually mean dynamically? So we know from climate models and this larger regional picture that we've compiled that there was this dipole, this wet-dry dipole relative to today that existed over the Western US and Mexico. And what we think is that the high pressure system, the interaction with the Aleutian low and the subtropical high basically resulted in the storm track, at the core of the storm track shifting northward over Lake Surprise, which is here in Northeast California, at about 17,000 years ago. So this is related perhaps due to a variety of different processes associated with the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet. And in subsequent papers, we and others have sort of explored some of the climate dynamics associated with this. You can see a recent paper that I published with Juan Laura and QSR. Okay, so for the rest of this talk, I'll go into how I've been developing quantitative reconstructions of the water cycle using lakes. This is a section of rocks that we've been studying this past year, my graduate student, and I visited and sampled from the Wacoba Lake beds in the Owens Valley on the east side of the Sierra Nevada. And this is a beautiful section of earliest Pleistocene lake sediments that basically record the water balance of the east side of the Sierra Nevadas at this time. So for the rest of this talk, I'll show you this quantitative framework that I've developed that was published in a paper in 2018 in geology. So what I'll show you today is that the last glacial maximum and other recent glacials like MIS6 and the mid-Pliocene and early Pleistocene really represent 2 wet states with very different drivers. So if we think of this as sort of a seesaw, for the glacial periods, precipitation and evapotranspiration are basically helping to push you over to wetter conditions. But during these warmer periods, warmer than today, precipitation actually has to outpace evapotranspiration in order to drive wetter conditions as observed in a lot of these lakes. So here's a compilation from Knott et al. In 2019 in a paper in GSA special paper, sort of compiling what some of these lakes looked like in Southern Nevada and California. And many of them had very wet conditions, deep lake conditions during the Middle Pliocene that, as we're finding with some of our new work, actually persisted into the early Pleistocene, and in some cases all the way until the Middle Pleistocene transition. And so this view is that during warmer conditions in the past, we had wet conditions. We know that at least for the Holocene, it's quite dry in the Great Basin. And perhaps in the Middle Holocene, it was even drier than today. But of course, during these glacial periods, like the last glacial maximum and marine isotope stage 6, it was much wetter. Okay, so let's look at the geologic evidence for these cold, wet, and hot, wet conditions between the last glacial maximum and the Middle Pliocene. So the left here is the last glacial maximum, and the right is the Middle Pliocene, and I'll just animate on the geologic evidence. You can see the ice sheets for the last glacial maximum, and this gray is basically today's inward draining basins in the Western United States. So here's the lakes that I've shown you maps of several times for the Western United States at the last glacial maximum. And then shown here in the squares are a compilation from Pound et al. In 2014 that are actually the lakes that are being used in the current Pliomip climate model ensemble. And then the circles are from another sedimentology database known as Macrostrat from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So this suggests that a lot of these inward draining basins during the Pliocene also had lakes that were probably much bigger than during the Holocene and the historic period. And then we can also compare this to these proxy compilations of wetter or drier for the past. So here's the same compilation filtered out of the lakes that I showed you earlier. And on the right, this is a compilation originally from Harry Dowsett and Peter Molnar, and most recently from our work for the Pliocene, suggesting that most of the vegetation and other proxies in the databases do suggest wetter conditions relative to today. So how can we use lake areas as a climate indicator? And I took this challenge that was sort of brought up by a paper when I was an undergraduate that Wally Broker wrote in the Journal of Climate in 2010. And I developed a model that was published in Geology in 2018, and it was also used by David McGee in a paper in the same year. And we have the R code publicly available, and we actually have another paper in review right now that will also have it available in Python for those that are interested. So when we set the change in volume for the change of time is equal to 0, and we rearrange, we can basically have this metric of the area of the lake relative to its basin, shown here on the right, it can be expressed by this equation shown here, where P is precipitation, K runoff is the runoff coefficient, E is the lake evaporation, and E is the lake evaporation. So we basically have some nonlinear terms that need to be quantified here. And I'm not going to go into the model details too much, but the sort of unique thing is that we need to basically assign how we deal with changes in the runoff coefficient with large changes in climate, because we know that this is nonlinear and it can change due to things like vegetation and soil type. And to do this, I use what's known as the Boudico framework, which is basically a mass balance framework for watersheds. And in addition, we have to quantify lake evaporation rates, and I use a net radiation with the Priestley-Taylor equation. Okay, so rather than discuss sort of the model inner workings, what I'll show you is an example for Lake Bonneville. So here's Lake Bonneville at the last glacial maximum, and then at its high stand after the last glacial maximum. And here's what the Lake Bonneville looks like today. So on the x-axis is temperature, the y-axis is the mean annual precipitation. This is the histogram of basically all the grid cells that sit within the watershed of Lake Bonneville today. And what the model is going to do is basically move these distributions about up and down, left and right. We're not going to touch the actual distributions. We're going to take the mean. So I'll be contouring essentially what this red point is here. So we're just going to move the mass balance model around and discover sort of what precipitation and temperature changes would have been necessary to drive the lake high stands that we observe. So here's this example for Lake Bonneville. Here's the modern Great Salt Lake and the Bonneville Salt Flats, as well as Utah Lake, contoured on here. It passes through a point of 0 and 1, so a factor change of precipitation of 1 and a temperature change of 0. So that's today. It should make sense to you that this has a positive slope, because if it gets colder, you need less precipitation to drive those same lake areas. And then we can run the model for all combinations of temperature and precipitation, with increasing lake area going up and to the left here in these contour plots that are shown here. We can then contour on the high stands that are observed, the Bonneville high stand at 18,000, so a little bit after the LGM, and then the Provo stand. During this time, Lake Bonneville was overflowing through the Red Rock Pass into the Columbia River drainage. So we know that this purple line basically has to be a minimum constraint on changes in temperature and precipitation. And one thing that we all know is that it was much colder during the last glacial maximum and during the deglacial. Here's some estimates using macrofossils from Harbert and Nixon in 2018, suggesting that on average it was about 6 degrees colder over the Bonneville Basin, which leads to changes in precipitation of something like 1.2 to 1.4x relative to today. We can actually compare these results to data that has been derived, or models that have been derived for the glaciers that actually spilled into Lake Bonneville. So here's the Little Cottonwood Canyon in the Wasatch Range spilling into Lake Bonneville here, and similar modeling has been done by Brendan Quirk. And here's what those modeling results looks like. And interestingly, lakes are much more sensitive to changes in precipitation, but glaciers, at least in the Western US, are much more sensitive to changes in temperature. And so as a result, we can sort of define this climate space that you see here by this diamond of, essentially the climate, the hydroclimate of the last glaciation. And this can then be a target potentially for climate models. In some unpublished work in collaboration with Radha Tripathi group, we've been measuring carbonate clumped isotopes from shoreline tufa and gastropods from Lake Bonneville. And we actually find temperatures to be potentially, on average, colder than some of the macrofossil temperature estimates. But we do, through our isotope mass balance models that are comparable to the model that I've just shown you, see similar sort of changes in precipitation. Okay, so now just to conclude, I'll show you what happens when you zoom this out to the whole of the Western United States. So I developed a forward model, and now it's the same axes, but I'm averaging over the entire Western United States. So here is temperature change from -15 to +10, and factor change of precipitation all the way up to 3x today. And we can put on those geologic observations that we observed for the last glacial maximum and for the middle Pliocene. And one thing you can see is that for a majority of the lakes, during both of these times, you do need some increases in precipitation. But one thing that is sort of interesting, and what we're discovering through our field work and through the work on these lakes in the Southwest US, is that these Southern Great Basin lakes that are shown here in this sort of smaller rectangle are where we have the best evidence and the best dated lakes for the middle Pliocene going into the earliest Pleistocene as young as 2 million years ago. And so if we just run this same analysis for this smaller rectangle that's shown here, we actually find that you require a doubling of precipitation rates in the middle Pliocene to explain the lake areas that are observed in these basins. And there's of course caveats associated with this sort of work. And recently in the most recent IPCC report, this sort of result and this observation, which is counter to what we think will happen in the future based on climate models and also based on the Pliocene climate models, as I'll show you on the next slide, was actually discussed. And so there's something we don't understand about the climate system in terms of its delivery of moisture to these Pliocene lakes that we know observed in some cases over glacial interglacial cycles. So it's not that they just existed during Pliocene or early Pleistocene glacials, but they existed during both continuously during Plio-Pleistocene glacial interglacial cycles early on. And so we've been comparing this to the newest PLMIP2 climate model ensembles that are shown here. This is a preprint that we actually posted on Earth Archive last week in collaboration with Juan Laura's group at Yale, led by his undergraduate, Sophia Menamenlis. And this is what the latest generation of climate models suggests for the Pliocene over the Western United States. And so it suggests a reduction in precipitation. Our modeling, similar to the previous slides, suggests that these lake areas, would have required increases in precipitation with the increases in temperature that we think that the middle Pliocene had. And here's what the climate model suggests. So something's going on essentially with moisture delivery to this region, and it's something that we're actively exploring. And there's an ICDP drilling workshop that just happened in the last month, where we have a series of sites south to north and west to east to try to understand what's going on during this time. One additional thing that we've been doing is we've been working with industry to obtain access to cores of these lacustrine lakes, because it's really the best records that we have. And so This is some work that we're doing in Clayton Valley, Nevada, which is right on the border between Nevada and California, with a big suite of collaborators that are shown here. We have 5 drill cores from this basin. 3 of them are almost a kilometer deep. And we have, high resolution argon-argon and uranium-lead dating of a lot of these ashes that are found in this basin. And as you can see, we have deep lake sediments from the Middle Pliocene through to almost the Middle Pleistocene transition recorded in this basin, and probably in a lot of other basins that there just isn't the outcrop constraints to show. So going back to this sort of figure from Not et al. In 2019, here's this edition of this Clayton Valley site that we've been working on, suggesting that from the Middle Pliocene all the way, until possibly about 1 million years ago, we had a persistent, relatively deep lake at times with some desiccation around 1.5 million. So I hope that I showed you today that the LGM and the MIS6 versus the Middle Pliocene and the early Pleistocene really represent these 2 wet states with very different drivers and the mechanisms behind that. I will just conclude by saying that I think that these small lake systems are important and highly responsive to hydroclimate forcings. There's been a lot of work done on the big lake systems, but I think that these smaller basins really allow us to interrogate the hydroclimate drivers in a better way. The LGM evaporation was probably important, and there was this pluvial response in the high stands that I showed you for Lake Surprise, and that this scaling relationship, this modeling that I showed you, really provides a first order constraint on the regional to watershed scale moisture budget. And of course, our group is going to continue doing a lot of work on the geologic observations, both from core and outcrop, as well as developing the modeling approaches further. So with that, I'd like to thank my mentors who are shown here on the right of this slide, and all of the funding from NASA, NSF, and the Heising-Simons Foundation, who have funded a lot of the work during my PhD and postdoc years, and NSF for now funding some of this work that we're continuing to do. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Are there questions for Dan?
I have a question. Thanks, Dan. That was a really nice talk. I spent a lot of time in the Eastern Sierras, so I've always loved to learn more about the Quaternary history. So it looks like you have a problem on your hands trying to understand what is the disconnect between your data and those models. And I was wondering how much thoughts you've given to ice cover in winter, especially for those smaller lakes, which might change the hydrological budget, and also just the way that snow might be impacting the hydrology of those lakes. And so if you have this consistent input of water into your lake because the snowpack melts slowly, I don't know from a hydrological perspective if that makes sense, but that could be something.
Yeah, I do think for Wacoba, which is the Owens Valley area and draining all the way down to Searles, that is certainly an issue that we haven't really accounted for in our modeling. So we know that there must have been snowpack in the Sierras and the Pliocene, and the Sierras were probably about as high as they are now, although some of our other work suggests it might have risen a little bit since the Pliocene. I think once you're further inland into the Great Basin, the proportion of water that's snowpack is relatively, there's some, but it's not enough such that we think that in even warmer conditions, you would have even more snow on those mountain ranges. So that's a great question, and it's something we don't explore. We're accounting for changes in precipitation, but we're not partitioning that into seasonal snow versus rain, during, say, the monsoon season, which we also know influences some of these, the lakes, at least in the southern Great Basin. So yeah, thanks for that question. It's something I'm always worried about when I do this modeling.
No, I think it's good. It's just now the tricky part is trying to integrate this into your model, which is like adding a whole new sub-module or something. But...
That's right, like a sublimation and melting model, yeah.
Any other questions? No? So, thank you, Daniel, again.
Thanks.
And I will give the floor to Alexander Flanke. Alex is a geologist graduated in Germany, in Cologne, where he took a PhD in geology paleontology on past sedimentary lacustrine processes of Arctic and Mediterranean. After being in Cologne, actively working for some years on Lake Ohrid project, he moved to Australia, where he occupied a position as research fellow, first at the University of Wollongong, then at the University of Adelaide. Alex published 52 manuscripts, papers, 8 of which as first author. Alex was nominated by Martin Melles, Melanie Lang, and Anthony Dosseto. So please just start your presentation, Alex, and you have, as the others, 20 minutes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear, and your presentation is okay.
Okay, thanks. So before I start my presentation, I would like to acknowledge the Ghana people and the Darul people, the traditional or historic custodians of the land that I'm presenting on here in Adelaide, and of the site, the Thirlmere Lakes, I'll be talking about later in my talk. So I want to talk a bit more about the interplay between climate, vegetation, and landscape evolution, and specifically about erosion. And of course, it's interesting to understand the evolution of landscape over time in response to these forcing mechanisms. But in particular in Australia and in Eastern Australia, there's also another significance that comes in play there, which kind of has some global implications. And to understand that, we actually don't have to go that far back in time. Australia was actually struck by a very extensive dry period between the early 2000s until 2009, which is also known as the Millennium Drought. This period was followed by a very wet interval, a wet year in 2011, mainly caused by very strong La Nina conditions and a very negative Indian Ocean dipole, which caused intensive precipitation, in particular across the eastern states. And this in turn also, as we see here on that map, significantly increased biomass across this usually very dry continent. And this picture here on the left-hand side, or these two pictures, were actually taken from the same site. And what also happens during these periods of intense wetting is, of course, we produce a lot of more biomass, which then leads to much more carbon dioxide sequestration from the atmosphere into the biomass and into the soils eventually. But our understanding what actually happens to this soil carbon in subsequent drying or in subsequent time intervals is very poor. And that even applies to very modern time scales. There was a second study here by Shackelton et al. 2016, who kind of looked into the relationship between soil organic carbon erosion and found this very strong relationship between both, which is probably not a big surprise. But if we think that a bit further, it actually also means that in that sense, soil erosion or soil organic carbon erosion reduces soil respiration, which then reduces the amount of carbon dioxide replenished back into the atmosphere. So if we, however, store our carbon in the sedimentary sink, we actually remove it from the contemporary carbon dioxide budget. Yeah. And this has actually not been accounted in Australian national greenhouse gas inventories. And not accounting for erosion actually has then, as claimed by these authors here, led to an overestimation of the carbon flux from the soils back into the atmosphere, carbon that was in reality actually transported and deposited in the sedimentary sink. And this is just on modern timescales. If we think about glacial, interglacial timescales, these uncertainties actually become even bigger because we have very little control or independent control of the interplay of erosion, vegetation, climate, and in particular of soil organic carbon erosion. And even our system models and global circulation models, they basically rely on pretty poor methods to account, or models to predict the vegetation cover and the subsurface carbon storage, but they do not account for erosion at all at the current stage. So what drove my research over the past few years was actually to find a kind of new method to get a better control, to get a better understanding of catchment erosion processes ideally inferred from sedimentary archives that we can also use to reconstruct the climate and vegetation history. And one of these methods that we can apply to fine-grained detrital archives, such as lake sediments, are, for example, these uranium isotopes. And how this works, I will explain a bit more in detail. So if we think about the fate of a detrital grain in the catchment, we have the bedrock, we have comminution destruction of the bedrock into fine powder. We got some storage in the weathering horizon, hilltop transportation, fluid transportation, and final deposition. And actually, with the help of the uranium isotopes and gas absorption analysis, we can quantify the time elapsed between this comminution and present days. If we then account for the age model based on our sediment core, sediment chronology, we can exclude the time since final deposition, and we get what we called in the early publications, it was called comminution dating, and we now rather prefer to use the term sediment residence time, which kind of gives us an estimate for how long the sediment spent, how much time the sediment actually spends in the catchment before final deposition. And if we zoom in a bit further into what actually happens with the uranium isotopes in the weathering profile, so we are looking into the activity ratio between uranium-234 and 238. And in bedrock, which is older than 1 million years, the activity ratio between uranium-234 and 238 is expected to be in so-called secular equilibrium. That means it equals more or less 1. In fine-grained detrital matter, fine powder smaller than 63 microns, we continuously lose the lighter, the daughter nuclide uranium-234 from our detrital matter, which then results in lower activity ratios usually found in detrital matter in fine powder. And since the weathering front, the interface between the weathering horizon and the bedrock moves downwards over time, we usually expect to find very high activity ratios close to 1, close to this interface. And the longer the material has been stored in the soil or in the weathering horizon, assuming steady state erosion, material has been stored for longer in that soil profile in the topsoil layers, which means that the time since comminution increases towards the top, and thus our activity ratio decreases towards the top. And this decay or this loss of 234 depends actually on the radioactive decay of 238, which is why we can actually calculate and quantify these sediment residence times. If we then think about what happens during erosion, shallow erosion, such as sheet was erosion, we preferentially mobilize the topsoil layer with our very low activity ratios, and we find relatively low activity ratios in our sedimentary archive. On the other hand, if we have deep erosion, such as gully erosion and mass wasting, we also mobilize the detrital matter with higher activity ratios, so we find somehow higher activity ratios in our sedimentary archive, turning into shorter sediment residence times for deeper erosion and longer sediment residence times for shallow erosion. So in that sense, we can also use our proxy as an indicator for the erosion depth. So this kind of research for me started on Lake Ochot and Lake Doiran. First methods or first publications on that method has been published in 2006 from the Pardo et al. But since then, the method has only applied to fluvial sediments and to some marine records, but it has never been combined in a detailed study with the vegetation reconstruction based on pollen data and with the climate history just inferred from traditional whatever climate proxy analysis we can apply to lake sediment records. So in the first study, or the first two studies, my collaboration partner from University of Wollongong, Tony Dossetto, and I, we applied these methods to these two sites from Lake Doiran and Lake Ochot. And I want to focus on the Lake Ochot Lake Glacier to Holocene record. For now, we applied the method to the deep site here in the central part of the lake. And what we found there, just to get a bit of understanding how the method actually works, is that during the late glacial and early Holocene, we find overall short sediment residence times, in particular during the warmer and wetter intervals, indicating somehow deeper erosion of potentially thinner soils. We see some kind of climate control on the proxy as well, because during short, colder and drier intervals, such as younger dryas, and here the end of the last glacial, we have somehow higher sediment residence time. So we see a climate-dependent response here during the late glacial and early Holocene. In the mid-Holocene, however, we suddenly see this massive shift to much longer sediment residence times, indicating more shallow erosion of somehow thicker soils, which cannot be explained by climate, because we would expect to find much wetter and warmer climates during the mid and late Holocene compared to the late glacial in particular. But we've also got the pollen data set here in black from the same record, pollen analysis for Lake Ochot and Lake Prespa carried out by Kostas Panagiotopoulos. And we can now precisely compare our catchment erosion proxy to the vegetation cover. And what we see is that we have the highest tree pollen abundance here just occurring at the end of the early Holocene. And if we take that into a transect here in the northeastern part of the lake, the situation in the lake glacial and early Holocene would be that we actually find dense woodland vegetation only at low altitudes, whereas higher altitudes we have grassland vegetation, which is very prone to this deep erosion of thin soils that we've also seen in our late glacial and early Holocene part of the record. Since the mid-Holocene then, however, dense woodland vegetation presumably covers all altitudes, almost altitudes in the catchment of Lake Ochot, kind of preventing and protecting these thin soils from deep erosion, thus explaining the shift to more stable hill slope characteristica in the mid and late Holocene, saying that basically from a climate controlled environment, erosion environment, to a more vegetation controlled environment, crossing a threshold here at the transition from the early to the mid Holocene. So now, if we have a bit of a better understanding of how that proxy actually works, we go back to Australia, to the Thirlmere Lakes. Yeah. The Thirlmere Lakes are a bit of a thermal history. At the moment, the lakes are pretty full with 1 to 2 meter water depth. There was periods where the lakes were pretty dry, but in the 50s and 60s, lakes were also filled with up to 5 to 6 meter of water depth. The vegetation is obviously different to the Mediterranean. We mainly find a relatively dense sclerophyll woodland vegetation in the catchment today. The site is actually located approximately 100 or 200 kilometers southeast of Sydney, here off the coast of Wollongong. And the Thirlmere Lakes actually consist of 5 lakes, out of which I will focus on the Thirlmere Lake here, lake number 3 mostly. And the lakes are actually located in a Sionic meandering river system with the catchment geology and these steep scarps being exclusively consisting of resistant hawksbury formation. We have some alluvial fans here separating these 5 lakes from each other. And lacustrine deposition is presumably started long time ago. There are no real good estimates, but probably beyond 1 or 2 million years. So Matthew Forbes from University of Wollongong has published already extensive data set on ecological data, geochemical data, and also a lot of chronological information. This approximately 7.4 meter long core covers in the lower part, penultimate glacial and last interglacial period, so approximately marine isotopes stage 6 and 5. We have a major hiatus here occurring at approximately 100,000 years before present, and sedimentation does not resume until approximately 17,000 years before present. This onset of sedimentation is also characterized by this distinct oxic layer, and we have more or less continuous sedimentation throughout into the Holocene. So Matt Forbes actually also published the first pollen data set on these cores already. We went basically back to this published pollen data set and selected those pollen taxa which are significant for the catchment vegetation cover only. I've plotted here in the lower panel Asteraceae and Poaceae as the grass and herb pollen taxa indications, and then at the top panel pollen taxa which are more indicated or like cover a wide range of shrubs and trees in the Australian landscape with Myrtaceae and Casuarinaceae and Acacia. But I didn't want to go back to the same what we did at Lake Ochot to just calculate the ratio of trees versus grasses, because I feel like you might lose a lot of information. Instead, we tried to find a method, a model that accounts for the whole variability in this pollen data set, and we applied partial least square regression analysis with our pollen data as loaded into the PLSR as predictor variables. And what we see here in particular for the last glacial interglacial cycle is a very strong positive loading by our taxa that comprise a lot of trees and shrubs, Acacia, Myrtaceae, Casuarinaceae, and negative loadings of our grasses and herbs, Asteraceae and Poaceae. We do see the similar pattern here for the late glacial and Holocene. The kind of weak negative loading for Acacia, from my understanding, is probably mainly related to this kind of noisy behavior of Acacia in the Holocene. But what this actually tells us that for both the last and current glacial interglacial cycle, we can use the response, the PLSR scores of our PLSR analysis as an indicator for the canopy and mid-story vegetation cover in the Filmir catchment. And if we summarize that and plot this, we kind of see that our colder and drier intervals, such as the late glacial and Mesozoic glacial, are characterized by a more open vegetation cover, and the warmer and wetter intervals, like the Holocene and equivalent to marine isotope stage 5e, being by a more dense canopy and mid-story cover in the Filmir catchment. And the neat thing of the PLSR is that we can now also include our response variable, which we use our sediment residence time estimates for the same interval. We do see a very strong relationship between our response and predictor variables. Otherwise, these PLSR model would also fail to run in the first place. But also, if we plot these response scores on top of our vegetation reconstruction, we see this very strong relationship between vegetation, or predicted soil erodibility depending on vegetation, and our sediment residence time as analyzed on the sediment core. And that in turn means that the erosion processes in the catchment of Filmir are really strongly dependent on the density of this vegetation cover in the catchment. It does not apply for this little excursion here, but we have to keep in mind where we also don't have any pollen because it's this oxidized layer, no pollen preserved there, that this is the onset of sedimentation after the 70,000 year long lasting hiatus. So what we assume that during this long period, erosional forces, sedimentary transport in the catchment are very, very weak, very slow. And we accumulate a lot of very old material in the catchment over time, with then when conditions became a bit more humid, as indicated by the onset of lacustrine deposition again, we kind of start to transport more material, this old material, into the catchment again. Yeah. So we do see this very strong relationship between vegetation cover, biomass production, because the majority of Australian landscapes is actually produced by shrubs and trees. And our erosion proxy. If we now go back to what actually happens in our weathering profile, we took the effort to dig a 50 centimeter deep soil pit in the catchment of the Filmir lakes. And we also analyzed our uranium isotopes on this soil profile again, to see if we actually see this expected trend towards lower activity ratios with shallower soil depth. And that's what we actually see. On the other hand, probably also not a too big surprise, higher soil organic carbon contents occur in particular in the topsoil layers, and organic carbon content in the greater soil depth is much lower. But that also means if we start mobilizing and eroding our topsoil layer by shallow erosion, indicated maybe for the interglacial periods by our long sediment residence times, we would in particular mobilize material that has been stored in the catchment for extended time and which is probably also enriched or has some sort of higher organic carbon contents. Deeper erosion, as we observed during the glacial periods, in turn would also mobilize material with the shorter sediment residence time, which we see in the paleoarchive, and material with somehow lower soil organic carbon contents. And if we try to put that back together, to basically try and better understand the catchment carbon cycling over time, we do find that during the interglacial periods, we have a high biomass production in the catchment, as inferred from our vegetation, from our pollen data, and our catchment erosion proxy, our residence time, indicates that we have preferred mobilization of the organic matter-rich topsoil layer, and probably also some loose leaf litter that sits on top of the soil horizon that we find today. We are currently also trying to explore if we find very similar consistent patterns across other sites in Australia. We have a preliminary data set from Lake George, which is a very iconic paleoclimate archive, just about 140 kilometers southeast of Filmir. We haven't transferred the uranium isotope ratios into sediment residence times yet, because we are lacking some additional analysis there. But we see a very consistent, similar pattern in our erosion story between the two sites, although Lake George is obviously much, much bigger, with a much bigger catchment compared to the relatively small and confined catchment at the Filmir lakes. So to summarize that, basically we have the interglaciers with high terrestrial biomass production and slow erosion mobilization of weakly decomposed topsoil, organic matter and leaf litter. Glacials in turn with low terrestrial biomass production and fast and deeper erosion. And mobilization of decomposed organic matter probably from greater soil depth. And just also to sum up a bit of the research that I've been doing on these uranium isotopes, I think we have a new analytical tool that provides us with the means to quantify catchment erosion on geological timescales. The first proxy was not able to show all the data shows that uranium isotopes and catchment erosion is indeed controlled by catchment erosion, catchment processes and erosion, and we have a very complex interplay between erosion, climate and vegetation. And just for the future, we need to get more sites, probably combine the data with vegetation modeling, and also to get more information on the soil organic carbon cycling with organic geochemical methods. With that, I also like to acknowledge in particular the Skopsko science community. In the early days of that research, there was a lot of support to developing this new project. Tony Dossetto from the Wollongong Isotope Geotechnology Laboratory, and in particular Tim Cohen from the Thirlmere Lakes Drilling Project. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alex. Are there questions for Alex?
I would like to ask a question, Alex. In one of your slides, you showed charcoal layer. And we, of course, we remember these huge fires there were recently in Australia. What is the impact of charcoal on your results?
I mean, it's something we have been debating intensively. And actually, we have a charcoal record for the same core as well. From what we see at the moment, that there is probably a distinct impact of fire activity on the vegetation composition, but it does not seem that we do see, at least on this geological timescale, a significant impact on the erosion processes. But it does not mean that this doesn't apply, because usually you will have a bushfire which clears up the landscape, which can then, following intensive rainfall events afterwards, obviously increase runoff and increase erosion into the lake basin. But I feel like if we have single individual events mixed into the background sedimentation that happens at the same time, we might not be able to pick up these events, these short-lived events in this method.
But does it the fact that it doesn't affect your erosion?
The method,
erosion
it does not impact the method per se. Is the question. It does not impact the analytical part.
Yeah.
So I would think, yeah. If that was the question, I was more about like the interpretation of, do we see an impact of erosion based in response to these bushfires?
Can you also state that it doesn't affect dramatically the erosion record? Is that an indication that there is a quick recovery of the landscape, or?
I mean, what we see at modern timescales, obviously an increase in runoff, an increase in erosion in response to this bushfire activity. But I mean, we look at a sample that we analyze, which summarizes maybe 300, 400, 500 years in one sample. Yeah, so we need a very pronounced or very high number of fire events that occur that then would actually transport that signal into our sample.
Okay, understand. Thank you.
Thank you for this quite important question and of wide interesting. Any other questions for Alex? I guess there are no, so I see Julie ready.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Julie Loisel is a physical geographer. She graduated at Quebec University. She got a PhD in Earth and Environmental Science at Lehigh University, working in peatlands from Arctic to Patagonia. Julie had postdoc positions at University of Lake and California. And after 1 year as a visiting assistant professor at Texas A&M University, she became assistant professor, where, and she has the position since 2017. Julie's research mainly focuses on the last 11,000 years on the Holocene, on the climate change and the long-term development of peatland ecosystems. And she published 20 first author papers and contributed to a total of 45. She has been nominated by John, or better to say Jack Williams with Kendra McLaughlin, and by Sarah Finkelstein and Etty Corolla. So please, Julie, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, Laura, for the introduction, and thank you everybody for being here. I'm assuming everybody can hear me good?
We can hear you.
Okay,
and the presentation is already in, so that's perfect.
Perfect. Yeah, so today I will be talking with you about peatlands. I have the opportunity with my work to study peatland deposits from all over the world, mostly in the high latitude regions, which is where most of those peat deposits are located. But I'm starting to move towards the tropics as well, where we are discovering more and more peat very quickly. Oops. Excuse me. Okay. Peatlands are found all around the world, from the Arctic to the tropics, even in Antarctica, which you will see here in just 1 second. Peatlands have been accumulating very large amounts of carbon throughout the Holocene as a result of the net primary production in peatlands is outpacing peatland decomposition ever so slowly. And so over thousands of years, the soils accumulate thick deposits of carbon. And so that's what we are seeing on these pictures here. Peatlands are arguably the most effective long-term terrestrial carbon sinks on the planet. They occupy only 3% of the global land area, but they sequester about 1/3 or 30% of the global soil carbon. So this is about 2/3 of the current atmospheric CO2 burden. As you can see here on the map, they are mostly located in the high latitude regions, because in these places, the evaporation is fairly low, the temperatures are cold, and so the soils remain wet, and this is why the peats are accumulating. The role of peatlands as a global cooling agent, that is the fact that the peatlands are sequestering a lot of carbon over time, has been known by scientists, I would say, since the 1990s, but it was not really mainstream knowledge for a long time. And here on the right-hand side, I'm showing you in the IPCC AR4, so this is back in 2007, for the first time, peat accumulation is finally shown as one of the important processes that is taking place and that is effectively cooling the global climate. And you can compare to CO2 fertilization, for example, how the peat is very good and important in the global carbon cycle. The contribution in terms of CO2 change in ppm is estimated at about 25 ppm. So despite their importance in the global carbon cycle as long-term carbon sink, they are still omitted from most Earth system models. And so this is something that my group and many others are actively trying to change by providing as much information about the peatlands as possible. And all of this matters because we are wondering what will happen to those peatland deposits in the future. And I would say that one of the mainstream hypotheses has been that with warming, here you go, with warming, the expectation is that the water table will draw down, meaning that the surface peats will decompose at a faster rate because they become dry, and also the microbial activity rate will be increasing given the warmer temperatures. And if I had to say, one of my first bigger contribution to this field has been that during my PhD and beyond, still today, what I've been working on is using the past record from peat cores to show actually that in past warm intervals, we see acceleration of peat carbon sequestration in many sites around the world. I suppose the jury is still out in terms of the future of the peatland carbon legacy. So these big savings accounts of carbon on the landscape, some anecdotal studies are showing that they will start emitting more CO2 to the atmosphere, but then a few other sites are showing that they will be sequestering more carbon. And so we don't know what is the magnitude of the change in terms of the net carbon balance on the global basis. And we are not even sure of the change in direction. So is it a positive or a negative feedback? So today in this talk, I will talk with you a little bit about two studies that I've been leading. One is looking at a very large synthesis, trying to get to the bottom of this question. And another one uses paleoecological records to look at a local example from Alaska. And after that, I will talk a little bit about some of the work I'm currently working towards. And it's integrating data and model using a really large synthesis of paleoclimate reconstructions and developing new modules for a peatland model. So the paleo approach that I'm going to talk about today, I can't really talk about it without discussing the important role of sea peat in my life. So sea peat is a group of people that it's a working group really from Pages, and we have been around since 2014, and sea peat has well over 200 scientists attached to it now. And what we are doing is compiling all the information we have about peat cores from around the world and the paleo information they contain. And we also are connecting with stakeholders to try and help inform land management decision with regards to peatlands. And so since 2017, I have the chance to be the co-lead of sea peat. And so that's allowing me to work with a lot of fantastic people from all over the world. So this is one of the studies that I want to talk about today. So here what we did is we asked all of our colleagues from the CP network to send us information from peat cores where we can calculate how carbon accumulation has changed through time. And so here you can see the 268 cores that we collated. And for each one of these cores, we know the basal age, and so when the peatlands started developing on the landscape. And then we have multiple radiocarbon dates throughout the profile that allows us to calculate carbon accumulation rates and how that has changed through time since peat inception. And we also have carbon content and other kinds of proxy information within the peat. And this synthesis here focused on the northern peatlands only, but we have other work that is looking at the globe. Here on the bottom right-hand side, you see time on the x-axis and peat carbon accumulation rate on the y-axis. And what you can see really briefly here is that during the early Holocene, between 8 to 10,000 years ago, carbon accumulation rate was greater than than the average for sure, but also than most of the history of these sites. And this is something that you don't necessarily expect, because if you think of a peatland and the way it accumulates peat through time, the older peat should be more decomposed and compacted. But what the synthesis is showing us is the opposite. So something happened to that peat that made it accumulate very quickly and be preserved pretty well. And in fact, looking at some of those peat cores, you can still see the fresh looking peat plant macrofossils in there. And so here you have an average of 27 grams of carbon per meter square per year, and then it decreases throughout most of the Holocene, reaching as little as about 18 grams per meter square per year about 2,000 years ago and during the neoglacial period of the Holocene. And then what you can quickly notice here is like this apparent increase of carbon accumulation rate near the present. And of course, this is something to be expected because it again is this low undecomposed surface peat that still hasn't quite made it into the long-term carbon store. And so what we did is we were trying to understand what led to this rapid increase in carbon accumulation in the early Holocene. And here, this is just from Berger and Loutre. It's showing you the summer insolation at 60 degrees north. And you can, as you all know, probably, the early Holocene came with high summer insolation in the Northern Hemisphere. And so our hypothesis, this is where it comes from essentially, that past warm intervals were in fact helping peatlands grow rapidly and store a lot of carbon. And as the climate started deteriorating during the Holocene, so did the peat accumulation rates. So this is really looking at vertical peat accumulation and how it might be related to past climate change. But the other big question that we've been having is, what about the lateral spread of peatlands? Because if we think about the global carbon cycle, it's important to know what was the area covered by peatlands since the last deglacial warming. And to do this, we look at a much larger database. And in this one here, we have over 2,500 basal sites where we date using radiocarbon the deepest peat layer possible. And we use this as a proxy for peat lateral extent on the landscape. And so on the right-hand side here, you can see the distribution of those basal ages. And again, there's this idea that there was really rapid spread of peatlands during the early Holocene. Of course, it might have to do with climate, but it also certainly has something to do with land availability following deglaciation. And then when we utilize the vertical and the horizontal data that I just showed you, we can then plot this into an empirical modeling approach that I helped develop that is allowing us to calculate what was the net carbon balance of those peatlands back in the day. And so how much carbon were they really soaking in versus how much were they releasing? And what we're showing is that there were a lot of carbon, about 80 gigatons per 1,000 year during the early Holocene. And this is more than enough to explain this blip here, the 10 ppm decrease in global atmospheric CO2 that has been measured in ice cores. And so this was one of these studies that showed that peatlands are truly important in the global carbon cycle and that we need to know more about them. And we need to know how resilient or how vulnerable their carbon stocks are to climate change. Just a quick update, we now have compiled so many more cores, so over 7,000, and we're using a completely different approach to see if we get to similar results. And here in the up below right, you see this model that we developed that is looking at this lateral extent of peatlands. And essentially, we have paleoecological data allowing us to differentiate between fens and bogs, and so different types of peatlands, and then how those different types of systems are impacting CO2, but also methane emissions. And so that we can do regional carbon assessments during the Holocene and assess the radiative effect of those peatlands. And this work, the implication is that if you remember in the introduction, I said that most people would have argued that peatlands are potentially losing carbon with warming. And then some of this work here that I just showed is suggesting the opposite. And this idea has been picked on by multiple modeling studies, including the one that I'm showing here on the left. And they are showing that with this idea that temperature limited peatlands will benefit from warming, really. They're suggesting that all the way until 2300 at least, even using RCP 8.5 scenarios, peatlands globally might remain a net carbon sink, even though in the tropics, what you can see here is that we will see carbon losses. And this is not accounting for land use change or anything like that, which I don't have time to talk about today. But yeah, so the tropical peatlands, of course, are already so warm that if you add some more warming on top of that, it's not going to help them. But there's so much more peat in the high latitudes, and the warming is helping them store more carbon. So to recap, the Holocene thermal maximum is used as an analog to show that there's warmer conditions can lead to faster rates of carbon sequestration in peatlands. And we're thinking it could happen in the future. And in fact, I have a project that is looking at the migration of the northern frontier of the peatland biome. And so we see some peat patches beyond where peatlands are currently found. And we're trying to figure out, using paleo tools again, what led to their development, for example, on the north slope of Alaska and in the Canadian Arctic, and whether or not those little peat patches or baby peatlands will be able to expand in the future. Now, I want to switch gears here a little bit and talk about an ecosystem shift that is also linked to climate change and carbon sequestration. This is a peatland that I've studied. I spent a lot of time there in Alaska during my PhD. And it's getting a little bit at this issue of the recent carbon accumulation rate and whether or not it's truly maybe a signature of the global climate, or is it just the fact that the peat has not decomposed, and how can we partition between the two? And this is a wicked problem for the peatland community. If we could understand this, it would be great, because right now, peatland management is happening all over the place, and we don't really know whether or not the peatlands are in fact becoming more effective carbon sinks in some places or not. And so what we did here is that you can see a peat profile on the left-hand side and the very decomposed mucky peat towards the bottom here. And then there's this very drastic shift in the peat, and it's essentially sphagnum peat that is colonizing the site. And so we use lead-210 and radiocarbon dating to establish when this transition happened, and it was in the early 1900s. We did a lot of other proxy information to reconstruct changes in the water table, and we looked at the pollen, the stable isotopes geochemistry as well, to really understand the hydrological change in that site. But essentially what is happening here is that the hypothesis, at least, is that this peatland was just kind of an unhappy peatland. You know, it was slowly accumulating carbon. It was kind of cold and very wet, and so the accumulation was not very fast. And then with climate warming, the peatland, the water table depth dropped down a little bit, just enough for sphagnum to start populating the site. And sphagnum is very recalcitrant to decomposition, and it took off, and it started accumulating these very fast, relatively thick peat deposit on top of that old peat. But still, that's not really assessing whether or not this peat from the surface will remain a carbon sink, or if it will all decompose away and join that mucky stuff at the bottom. And so I developed during my PhD an approach that allows us to take the past record and back calculate what would have been the net carbon uptake from that peat a long time ago. And this is what you're seeing here on the right-hand side. And so the net carbon pool is what I'm measuring from the core. And then I can back calculate the net carbon release based on an ecological model. And then that allows me to establish or quantify the net carbon uptake of this system. And just note for 1 second that this is about 18 grams of carbon per meter square per year for about the past 12,000 years. Now, what I do is I pick the top part, and what I'm doing instead is I'm forward decomposing that peat to see after 100, 200, 300 years, how much of that peat should be left based on its own intrinsic properties. And this model is suggesting that there would be over 50 grams of carbon per meter square per year left, even though we decompose it for 300 years, which is a lot longer than the amount of time it takes for peat to go into the long-term carbon store. And so we are suggesting here that this change in vegetation that happened about 100 years ago might lead to an increase in carbon sequestration somewhere between 4 to 10 times in those ecosystems. And we do expect to see such changes across northern latitudes, pretty widespread. So this was a pretty exciting finding that we connected through this conceptual model here, where warming will lead eventually to drier surface peatlands, which could lead to sphagnum dispersal and thick peat formation. So in other words, it's this sweet spot for rapid carbon accumulation that might be achieved in some places. I already mentioned the baby peat patches that we are seeing in the northern limit of the peatland biome. Now, the issue is that you could see this study a little bit as an anecdote. Okay, so I was able to show this at one site. We might be able to see it at multiple sites. But then if you drive 100 miles south, you'll see that there's a peatland that is arguably under the same climate, but it's drying and there's shrubs growing on it. And so one of the big questions for me is trying to reconcile and make sense of all of the paleo information that we have. And so in order to do this, it's time to become a modeler. And I always stayed away from modeling because I love to be in the field and in the lab so much. But I think that in order to understand the intricacy of peat accumulation and peat decomposition and changes in ecosystems and vegetation, and how hydrological feedbacks might be modifying the system, you really need a model to do this, and especially if you want to project for the future. Here I'm just showing you again a few pictures from the peatlands, but essentially what we're doing is that we are asking the whole peatland community to give us not only peat carbon data like I did a few years ago, but now all the paleo data that they have available. We started this, and all of the information will be stored onto Neotoma, which is a database that you probably all are aware of. And the data that we're interested in are mostly testate amoeba, which is the little stuff you see in the upper right. So those microorganisms allow us to reconstruct changes in water table depth. So they're paleohydrological tools. And then we are also looking at plant fossils, which you can see some examples in the left here. And then of course, those are telling us about the shifts in ecosystems. We are also asking the community for stable isotope geochemistry, and so carbon isotopes, oxygen and deuterium, so that we can reconstruct changes in temperature, but also in moisture pathways. And what we're gonna do with all of this, first of all, this is kind of a dream of mine, that peatland archives be recognized to be at the same level of lake reconstruction, ice reconstruction, tree ring reconstructions, because right now the peatland record is kind of left out from a lot of the regional reconstructions. And as far as I can tell, there's no real good reasons for that. And so I think that's part of the work I'm doing now, putting together this large synthesis will make the work we've been doing for decades now in my community more valuable and also easier to utilize by the broader paleoclimate community. And so anyways, what we are doing now is on one side, we are doing the paleo data synthesis. And then on the other side, we're using this peat model that already exists that is called Digibog. And Digibog is pretty cool because it's allowing us to play with the temperature and the hydrology and modifying the water table. And we're seeing peat grow. And then we're adding sub-modules into this. So we're adding a plant macrofossil sub-module so that now Digibog in its peat layers will be tracking how peat is decomposing through time. And it will also allow us to look at the proportion of different plant fossils in the model. We're also going to be inoculating the first peat layer with testate amoeba, and then the water table behavior in the model would be dictating year after year which testate amoeba are going to be populating the peat cores in the model. And then we're going to do the same thing with stable isotope geochemistry so that we can track essentially how the peat proxies get encoded into the peat profile. And we do this because we need the model, like I said, to project how the future change in climate and land use will impact carbon balance. But we also need a reality check for the model because, you know, if the model can't reproduce the past, I don't want to use it to predict the future. And this is where the power of the paleo data comes into play, at least in this case. And so we're going to be coring the model and comparing it with real case studies from around the world. So from the tropics, the boreal region, the temperate regions as well, see how the model is doing. And once the model has been validated with the past, we'll be able to then utilize the model alone and project what could happen in the future by forcing a number of scenarios, including drying and flooding, and also grazing, draining, mining, restoration on those sites. Just to wrap up here, this current work and upcoming work, the idea is to really shed light on the process. So what's happening within the peat and how are the peat proxies really encoded, so that we're hoping that once we have this written down and that the model can reproduce it, people from other paleoclimate archives will be able to say, oh, okay, so these peatlands are not just sponges on the landscape, they're actually working and recording something, so we can integrate them into our paleo records. And the other thing is that it will allow us to make sound predictions for the future of peatlands and hopefully help us provide information for land management and protection. And protection is in fact a big deal. And here, this is my last point, is that peatlands have been suggested as very important natural climate solutions. And so you probably all heard about the net zero objectives that the IPCC AR6 just put out. And if we just if we help people understand that just not touching the peatlands is a very big deal, and also using this model, we could point into the direction of places where peatlands should be preserved at all costs, because they will be really able to help us offset our anthropogenic CO2 emissions, and also avoid the emissions from degrading those really large soil deposits. So to conclude here, my first bigger contribution was to show that past warm intervals can really help increase carbon sequestration, even though that was counterintuitive. At the local scale, we can utilize a lot of the proxies that have been around for decades, as well as some more recent proxy development to reconstruct changes in the ecosystem itself and link it with climate, but also with the carbon cycling in those ecosystems. And then lastly, I'm spending a lot of time synthesizing the existing paleo data and then help develop a new model that will allow us to understand how those proxies get into the model, so that into the peat, so that we can use the model and feel confident about the predictions for carbon in the future. So with that, I will stop here and I will entertain any question you have for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there questions for this interesting presentation?
Okay, and I would like to ask a question, Julia. Really, first of all, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. The question is related to, let's say, the quaternary environment which dominated the world for a long time, and that's about the mammoth steppe environment. And I was asked recently about my opinion about the fact that some people would like to reconstruct the mammoth steppe environment by introducing large herbivores again in the north. They all had the whole idea is actually to go back in time and to clone the mammoth, and so to reintroduce the mammoth steppe environment. And I know there are important initiatives in northern Siberia, and I was wondering, what would you say to those people when it comes to carbon balance?
Yeah, you know, I would say, have you not watched Jurassic Park? But I see the virtue in the idea and the hypothesis, but I think this is a very large scale enterprise, and I honestly wouldn't feel very comfortable if people were to do this, although it could work as a potential for carbon storage. And we know this because I work at my university with a lot of agriculture people, and they're interested in the carbon footprint of cattle. And I was asking them, how bad is it if people eat meat? And they were telling me that if people were eating bison, there would be no problem because, well, there's a caveat to that. But they said because bison just tramples the ground, and so even though they are ruminants and they emit a lot of carbon, they also contribute to storing carbon into the soil. And the positive and the effect is in fact a carbon drawdown. But they said, if you tell that to people, then everybody will eat bison, and then there will be large farms, and then that effect will be gone. And so I see how that could work in the Arctic as well, following that same process. But I just, I like to think that the climate change is happening fast and it's changing the ecosystems. And when we try to restore an ecosystem, it leads us to some ethical issues and potentially and technological problems. Because if you have an ecosystem that used to be healthy 110,000 years ago, I'm not sure that returning it today still works. I think the conditions are changing and it may or may not work at all. So that's the short rambling that I wanted to say about this. I wouldn't do it.
Yeah, I fully agree also. I'm also skeptical about this, but I talk to people who are really convinced that this is the way they would like to go, to clone the mammoth first, and then. But then I said, yes, but what about the area? We can reintroduce the mammoth steppe environment by to influence it and to reconstruct the area and so on. But the carbon influxes of the carbon balance will be. Is that another argument not to do it, or is it?
Yeah. And, you know, even without the cloning of the animals, which is problematic to say the least, but just even restoring the tundra, you know, and this is a parallel also. Some of the work we want to do with this modeling approach and that I just described is, you know, a lot of places, especially in the UK and in Europe, there is this big push to restore a lot of the peatlands that have been degraded over the past century. And the thing is, we know that we can restore the carbon balance to some extent over short term. This is what edicovariance studies have showed us. But we don't know how resilient those systems will be to climate change. And so just the UK, they're suggesting to spend something around 8 to over 20 billion pounds in restoring ecosystems. And we don't even know if those systems will survive any rapid change in climate or in hydroclimate. And so to me, you know, like trying this at an even larger scale in the Arctic, which is changing even faster for climate, is not based in sound science, is what I would say.
Thank you. Eniko, please.
Thank you. It was a wonderful talk. I have one question regarding the recessing end of the peatlands, because we are living in that place where sphagnum disappears and the peatlands are drying. How is this process recorded in the sea peat? So do you have any proxy that you collect for that to estimate the areal extent of the area where sphagnum will disappear and will be replaced by other, mainly sedges?
Yeah, can I ask, where are you located?
I'm located in the Carpathian Basin, so in Central Eastern Europe.
Okay, I see.
Carpathians are.
Yeah. So in your case, there's a lot of atmospheric pollution that has also changed the geochemistry of the peatlands, and I think some of the sphagnum, not those. Okay, maybe that's another site. But yeah, there's lots of different forcings that that can lead to loss of sphagnum. And in the paleo record, we see, well, I mean, the sphagnum tissues are very well preserved, and so we can track them when are they present or absent. And so on a core-to-core basis, that's pretty straightforward. And then in the case of peat deposits that are too decomposed, that are just, they almost look like, I hate to say the word, to use the word dirt, but they just look like some kind of mud. We also have geochemical proxies we can use to reconstruct whether or not sphagnum was present. So we can use that. And as you probably know, in the past, pollen, and in fact, spores of sphagnum have been used to reconstruct the extent or at least presence of peatlands and sphagnum. The problem with that is that sometimes sphagnum decides that it does not want to do spores. It only reproduces asexually. And so we know when there's spores that there's sphagnum, but if there's no spores, we don't know really if there was sphagnum or not. So, you know, that's why we need multiple proxies to get to these kinds of answers that you're asking. So those are the tools that we're using to address that. Does that answer your question?
So thank you very much. I don't know if there are other questions for Julie.
Yeah,
No,
Laura,
okay.
I have a question. Yeah, Julie, that was a really fantastic, wonderful talk. It gave me a lot of information about the peatlands. I was just curious to know, because you mentioned in the beginning that you're also looking at tropical peatlands. So is that in your database yet, or it is mostly the high latitude ones?
Yeah, in the database, we have some carbon sequestration values from the tropics. There are some paleo records that have been done from peatlands, but they are not in the database. And this is one of the big difficulties, is that people love to go out and do new research and publish it, and then they don't share the actual raw data. And that's why this is I mean, half of my time, I try to convince people to send me their data. I'm saying, just send it to me. I will reformat it. I will do all of this for you because we need it so that others can utilize them. So in terms of tropical peat on Neotoma, I haven't checked really recently, but I don't think there is any record, or maybe there's one, but they are out there. And so over the next few years, they will all become available.
Yeah, and because I think that the tropical peat systems are are slightly different because like you have high elevation peatlands in the tropics, at least in India, but you also have low elevation ones, really, I mean, sea level ones, which are in hot places. They are not in cool places at all. They are in hot places. And they are in places, they are in the river valleys where people settle for a long, long time. And peat is the best thing you can use for agriculture. So it means that you don't really, you know that it's there theoretically, but finding a lot of it and finding it, you know, undisturbed is a big challenge. So like, I mean, if you're thinking in terms of, which is a very good thing, because I think it's a great initiative that you have this database of peatlands, because it would be really wonderful to compare across ecosystems. But I think there's a lot of things. So it was just my
there is so much. There is so much we don't know, and I wish I had, you know, a day to talk to you about this. But just a couple quick examples. In the tropics, there's most of the work, as you probably know, comes from Indonesia peatlands. Although we do have cores from the Amazon basin, a little bit from Central America, a little bit from India, but not much. But in what was I going to say? In Indonesia, we know that right now there is a lot of fires that are really that are burning up the peat literally very fast. But based on the paleo record, there used to be no fires back there. And so there's a compounding effect of land use change that is drawing down the water table, and then the fire can come in, and also the combination of El Nino years that are drier. So the dry season is drier, and then the wet season might be a little shorter, but that's still up for debate. But essentially, we know that there's changes that are happening that are very detrimental to the ecosystems. Not only the fact that land conversion is happening, but those are propagating like feedbacks with the fires. So that's something that the paleo record is teaching us. Another example, real quick, is that a bunch of people have eddy covariance flux towers in Indonesia. And what they are showing is that an apparently intact, beautiful lowland peatland right now is a carbon source. And you know, the peatland has 10 meters of peat underneath the flux tower. So you know that this site has been accumulating carbon for a very long time. So why right now is it a carbon source? And and that's why I'm saying that the process understanding of how these systems work, we still don't know. And probably the answer in this case is either that the temperature is just too warm now, and so the respiration finally caught up, or we think that maybe the precipitation, it's not so much that the precipitation amount has changed, but the timing of the precipitation might be impacting the hydrology just enough to make that switch from a sink to a source. And that's why the models are necessary to help us answer those questions, so we can better understand and then manage those sites. Because maybe we need to keep those sites wet so they keep acting as carbon sinks. Right now, we don't know. And people are making decisions every day about peatlands without having this process understanding.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Other questions for Julie?
I'd like to ask for a question. Thank you very much for your interesting talk. And my question is, when you make a larger scale synthesis, you would need to collect many data from the literature that were produced by different laboratory, different people. And how did you make the quality control of this data to make them comparable? It would be a huge job.
Yes, that's a good question. And you know, for the carbon story, it's not too difficult in that all we need is density of the peat, carbon content, and then what is really important is the chronological control, so that we can really assess changes in carbon accumulation rate. And so in this case, you know, every data set or every date, we have the lab number, so we know where it comes from. I cannot check each date to make sure that it's a good one. We redid every HDEP model with that said, so that we know that the HDEP models are equal across all the cores, and that the methodology is as sound as we can make it. The other thing that we do is we ask every data contributor how they calculated the bulk density, how they calculated carbon content. And so we know their methods. And then the last thing is that for a Holocene reconstruction, let's say 10,000 years, we have a minimum number of radiocarbon dates or chronological constraints. So if you just have 2 dates, I'm so sorry, but I can't include your core in my reconstruction because I can't say anything about millennial timescale for that reason. So we needed, I can't remember exactly what we decided, but there was a cutoff, maybe 7 dates for 10,000 years or something along those lines. So it's not so much a quality control, but it's at least a standard that you had to reach in order to be able to be in the database. And oftentimes what we did is we had extra funding. So if somebody didn't have enough dates, we offered that they would send us actual samples and we send them to the radiocarbon lab ourselves so that now your core becomes eligible to be in the database. So we also did something along those lines.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions for Julie? No, so if I can say something, I was very impressed by all the presentations of today, this morning, this afternoon, this night, how to say, I don't know, for us it's still afternoon. Thank you very much to our young quaternarists. And may I ask to switch on your microphones and applaud our young researchers, please. Even if we are not so many now, I think they deserve our claps.
Thank you.
And thank you very much indeed. And I want just to add a consideration before giving the floor to the president of INQA, to Thais. You all showed that the paleoenvironment and the paleoclimate can be investigated from really different perspectives. And you all presented interdisciplinary and modern research. So thank you very much for this. And even if you've been dealing with the different proxies, all your introductions focused on past climate change and on the role that the study of quaternary can have in, let's say, helping to understand our future. And this is a very important take-home message for all the INQA members. And we have to be very proud of the contribute that INQA could give to our society. So thank you very much again. And please, Thais, can you?
Yes, I would like to
conclude. Thank you very much again.
Now, I would really like to stress, as you already said, that the contributions were very impressive. Were different topics, but really shows the good level of work young scientists are doing nowadays. A lot of modeling involved, and I think this is a really an important addition, especially for people with my age, which we didn't deal so much with modeling and so on. But still, I think it's fascinating to see what you can achieve by collecting the data and using these data for future predictions and also to model the past. It was really impressive, and I'm really very glad that you four are nominated so that we can learn more about your research. So therefore also I would like to thank the nominators for mentioning your name. We will within the committee chaired by Laura, we will make a decision about who will finally get the Shackelton Award. That will be notified during the next month, during November. And then, of course, you will formally be awarded during the INQA Congress, which is will take place in 2023 in Rome. And I really hope to see all participants there. and also to see more of your presentations at that Congress. It's really, really very impressive. And I feel sorry that not so many people attended this meeting. The whole idea to have an in-person presentation came up rather late, and so that was also the reason why it was difficult to organize and to organize a bigger meeting. Still, I think it's very useful for us, and hopefully also for you, and hopefully also that this meetings will have an offspring for other young scientists to work in that direction. And so at the end, to finalize everything, I would like to really thank you all. Thank Laura for chairing this session, and Lynn for organizing the technical part of these meetings. It's also visible on YouTube, and I don't know whether this YouTube movie is available afterwards. Lynn, can you say something on this?
I will check on that. I think it is, and then I will send out the link so that people that were not able to attend today can view the presentations.
Yeah. So that would imply also that link will be published in INQA newsletters in the future, so that more people will see your presentations and will be more aware of the good research you were doing. So thank you very much all, and especially thanks for all the speakers. I was really impressed. It's wonderful to see you in person, but also to see your work you are doing. Thank you very much. And I hope to meet you soon in the future, and I wish you all the best with your research also. Thank you for attending. Bye-bye.
Bye.